أعوذ بالله من الشيطان اللعين الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. In the name of God, most merciful, ever merciful. And may God's peace and blessings be upon His holy Prophet Muhammad and the purified members of his household and progeny. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajil farajahum. Respected sisters, dear brothers, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. And thank you for joining us once again after this extended absence, leave, interruption from our life series. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to continue with these lectures and lessons, inshallah. It might be worth mentioning very quickly what we covered and where we stopped, hatta we continue building on it. You will remember that we were discussing the role of the intellectual in the Islamic community of knowledge. And this comes as a result of a long series of topics that eventually led us here. This theme is the theme of reason and rationality and knowledge in Islam. And we are now past the 100 lectures. And the reason for starting with this theme in our life series is that first, we said this is given the importance that our religion gives to reason, rationality, and knowledge, to the extent that it is difficult to find anything else that our religion considers more important than what our religion calls al-aql and al-ilm. And in fact, when you look at it a little bit more closely, you see that this is because it is the foundation of belief. Our entire belief system requires to have the proper understanding, the proper knowledge, and to be able to assess right from wrong so that you can believe in it. And the second reason why we started with this topic or this theme is that we said in a lot of cases for many of us, we need to what I refer to as reformat or rewire ourselves Islamically, based on the teachings of the Holy Quran and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And this requires that we start from scratch, building our foundation in alignment with these teachings. And so we're starting to try, at least, to align ourselves with Islamic teachings by going to the core, by looking at the Scripture itself and not spending too much time on what is outside of the ayat and the riwayat themselves, to the extent possible to understand the spirit of our religion when it comes to these matters, so that we then learn to a certain extent to extract these teachings by ourselves and to learn how to apply them to our own personal and daily lives. We established the crucial importance of knowledge in our religion, and we said the alternative to that is what we call jahl, which translates as both ignorance, as in lack of information, lack of knowledge, as well as foolishness, lack of an understanding in how to apply reason in our lives, so in conduct as well as in theory. And that's why we translate al-jahl by ignorance and foolishness both together. And we saw that this is not an acceptable alternative in Islam, which means that knowledge is not a nice to have, reason is not a nice to have in our religion, it's obligatory, it's necessary. With that said, before we go any further, we saw that our religion says there are two conditions that have to be met for knowledge to be considered Islamic. And inshallah, we will discuss more at length the types of knowledge that our religion encourages. But until then, the two main conditions that apply to anything to become Islamic knowledge is first, that it is acquired and used with sincerity, and secondly, that it leads to action, or that we translate that knowledge into action. And that's why we said that it has to become transformational knowledge. Any knowledge that we acquire has to affect our soul, has to affect our heart. And this shows in how we conduct ourselves in the world. When we do that, then we know that this is the type of knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to acquire, that our religion considers useful and beneficial to us. With that out of the way, we have to get on our journey to acquire this knowledge, which makes of us learners and seekers of knowledge. So we spent a little bit of time understanding what it means to be a seeker of knowledge. And we said that as soon as we start seeking a certain amount of knowledge, we are now carrying a certain amount of knowledge, which makes us a alim, which we usually translate as a scholar. But that's not really what alim means. It simply means someone who carries a certain amount of knowledge. And this is relative. To the extent that you carry that knowledge, you are a alim, you are a knower, a knowledgeable person in that knowledge that you carry, which may be little or a lot. And so as soon as this happens, then you start falling in the category of the alim, which comes with all sorts of duties and responsibilities to do something with that knowledge for yourself, towards yourself, as well as towards others. So we next spent a bit of time studying what it means to be someone who carries knowledge in our religion. Those two ingredients, when we put them together, they become the core of what we called and what we can build later on, which we have been discussing, a community of knowledge. We have the two main ingredients for that community. We have those who seek knowledge, and we have those who can share knowledge. Beyond those, there are a host of other figures, roles, individuals who may contribute to that community, who should also find a role and a space for themselves in the community of knowledge and Islam. Before we talk about them, we said that it's important that we establish that in Islam there is, as much as we give importance to the individual dimension in our religion, there is an important collective dimension that is often ignored, that we don't spend time studying, thinking about, and seeing what it means for us specifically, for our duties, responsibilities in life, and that is the collective dimension. That we are not only separate, autonomous individuals in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the eyes of Islam. Yes, we are, and that makes us responsible for ourselves and what we do in the world, but we are also part of greater wholes than us. Those wholes include, for instance, being a member of a family, being a member of a community, being a member of a society, being a member of the species, to each and what applies to them and their capability, their capacity to affect change in the world. Once that out of the way, we came back to talk about some of the important ingredients or figures who are part of the community. And we wanted to focus on, one, those that have been emphasized, insisted on in the Islamic literature, in the Islamic scriptures, in the Holy Quran and the teachings of Ahlul Bayt, and the ones that are most relevant to our lives. If we want to build this community of knowledge, what does that mean? So this took us on the little bit of a journey to start talking about these figures. So in addition to the learner and to the teacher, we talked about, one, the role of everyone and how everyone fits into that community. Secondly, we talked about the importance of the youth and, by extension, all the way to children specifically. Thirdly, we talked about the importance of, and this is to rectify misunderstandings in some of our communities, the role of women in that community of knowledge and the roles that they can play. Fourthly, we talked about the importance of the family as a full unit, participating, contributing to, and being part of the community of knowledge. And finally, the intellectual. And this is the last one that we will look at as part of the community of knowledge before, inshallah, we come back to wrap it up. And we said the figure of the intellectual is a topic that, one, is very relevant to us living in the West today and living in this point in history. And this is because of a series of events that have taken place in the world, in the Western world, and then eventually in the Islamic world. And we explained what that meant for the Western world and why the Western world started to look at the figure of the intellectual before the Islamic world. They had a crisis. They had to deal with the Enlightenment and modernity and the new roles in society and where truth comes from, and therefore the role of these initially these elites, these educated elites who are supposed to be the intellectuals, and then how that notion opened up with time. And then we also saw that this trickled into the same discussion, trickled into the Islamic world and the Arab world, where they started to have to deal with the same issues with kind of a delayed effect, because the West had to deal with these revolutionary, social, religious, cultural transformations, political, economic, and all the rest, transformations that took place in their societies that eventually also affected the Arab world and the Islamic world. All of that said, it brought us to look at some of the main figures in the Western tradition who have looked at the question, to start to look at a few trends. And you'll remember that we said the main big three trends that we were focused on is how many of them focused on the power structures of society and the role of the intellectual in those power structures. Secondly, how many of them became, I'm going to say, either cynical, critical of the role of the intellectual in those societies and what that means, and that we shouldn't give them too much power or take what they say blindly, and so on and so forth. And then thirdly, we talked about how they gave importance to what extent an intellectual will be engaged or not engaged in the day-to-day political, economic, activist roles that they may play in their society. Do they stay neutral and distant from what's happening so that they remain a true intellectual, as some have said? Or is the true intellectual also someone who is committed morally with values and ethics that mean that they are going to be part of taking action and trying to change the world themselves based on what they believe and what they know? And we saw, both ends of the spectrum, so I don't want to repeat any of that. And then we went into what happened in the Islamic world. And we said we're talking about all of this because we think this is extremely important for our own communities. There are lessons to be learned from all of this. There are themes that still are very relevant to us. One, because we live in the West, and two, because we are Muslims living in the West, we are minorities living in the West, but contending with, struggling with, thinking about these same issues and these same questions now within our own communities. And depending on where we land in our thinking, it may force us to revisit how we structure our communities, how we think about all these roles, the roles that we play ourselves with our families, with our friends, within our communities. What does this all mean for us? This is the relevance piece of it. We said in the Islamic world and in the Arab world, and I mentioned the Arab worlds because this is where my focus has been, and scientifically speaking, I haven't looked at that much. I can speak a little bit about it, but I can't go into the details of to what extent this has applied to Malaysia and Indonesia and Philippines and so on and so forth, where of course there are populations in the hundreds of millions of Muslims there as well. So I am focused on the Islamic world and / the Arab world, which do not always entirely overlap as well. And we saw that the main drivers for looking at the figure of the intellectual was not entirely the same as we found in the Western world. And the reason for that is because the Islamic world went through a very different set of developments, historical developments. In the Islamic world, there was never a clash between religion and the church, or religion and society, for instance, as we found, for instance, in the case of Christianity in the West, where that was initially determined, identified as being the culprit and the issue for a lot of the oppression and a lot of the issues in society, the oppression, the misery, the poverty, the injustice, all of that was now being linked back to religion, and that's why they had to get rid of it. That never happened in the Islamic world. And until today, in the Islamic world, there's a general understanding that if there are issues, the majority of the thinking, whether it's thinkers or the masses, they do not say that the issue is with Islam itself, even though sometimes that is a minority opinion, which of course we reject and we would argue against. There is a very minority opinion that says that, but generally speaking, the crushing masses of the Islamic world, they say that if there is anything wrong with the Islamic world, it's Muslims themselves, it's the societies themselves in not knowing how to apply religion. Then within that, you have those who say what application of religion or which version of religion needs to be applied. But the general agreement is that we're not trying to get rid of Islam. We're trying to either say that Islam did not address all of these issues, therefore we have to look for answers elsewhere, or Islam addressed the issues, but it also gave us the tools to adapt it to the realities, or Islam addressed these issues and we just have to follow blindly whatever it did and history, and we have to recreate the world that Islam was initially revealed in and the initial Muslims, right? Like these are the extremes in the spectrum of how Muslims have reacted to what has been they have been trying or struggling to resolve. Within all of that, and not to go into too much detail, so therefore we said there are some of the main thinkers, some of the main figures that we definitely need to know about all of this. The first one has to do with, right as with the advent of modernity and Islam wanting to deal with all of that, we have figures like Rifa'at Tahtawi. I'm not going to go repeating everything that we mentioned there, but we see how there was a push towards a revolution or a revival or a rethinking and modernizing of education systems and the Arabic language, and to start to rethink what do we put in our curricula for our students in our countries so that we start to play catch up to the industrial, scientific, technological advances of the West where we have fallen behind, while at the same time giving importance to the Arabic language, one, and two, to Islamic values and teachings. This is generally speaking what we start seeing. And then with a specific focus on the role of the intellectual within that. So the intellectual has to be the one who plays a prominent role in pushing this, in making sure that it happens, in bringing the right type of knowledge, specialization, education, building those curricula, exposing the Islamic and Arab worlds to what is beyond, and being selective in what to bring in and what to not to bring in, and so on and so forth, in order to lead this social progress that is required. Then we talked about the figures of Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani and Muhammad Abda and Rashid Rida and Sayid Qutb and the roles that they played. And we saw that there we see a very now deliberate, open attempt at revival of Islam. Now Islam is falling behind, not because there's anything wrong with the religion, but because Muslims do not know any longer how to apply this religion to day-to-day life. They have failed to have the right people in the right positions, and so they start criticizing the role of the imam, the cleric, being too focused on the tradition, not taking into consideration more modern types of knowledge that are required. They need to be more aware of what is happening in the political systems, the economic systems, what is happening in technology, and introduce that with that mind frame into religious Islamic teachings so that they are addressed. These are the realities of the world. You can't keep talking about things that happened 500 and 1,000 years ago. You have to talk about what is happening today. And they started to move towards the importance of mobilizing and bringing people together, hence the role of the intellectual, bringing people together around all of this. Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani pushed a lot with the idea of unity being led by these types of intellectuals, and reconciling Islam with the demands, with the requirements, the needs, the social needs of these types of societies that are political, that are social, issues of poverty, issues of human rights. These things need answers, resolutions at the core from Islamic thinking. We can't just follow blindly, and we cannot just rely on the traditional way of thinking to resolve these types of issues. So we talked about Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani in that way. And he said, so new types of scholars are required. Those are the scholars who are philosopher scholars because they have that open-mindedness and they are able to select and they have that wisdom. And we talked a little bit about this, and we said that we even find these types of ideas in some Western Paeda and others. We talked a little bit about it, that wisdom to know how to apply the right types of knowledge to the right issues in life. And we saw the same thing with even more, because while Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani is not known necessarily to be a major scholar of religion. Muhammad Abda was. Muhammad Abda was an Azhari scholar, and when he talks, he can talk on behalf of, or he is a good representative of scholars. And he says, our current scholars are not the ones that we need. We need to rethink how we train our scholars, our clergy, the members who represent our religion. We need to rethink the education system that goes into that. But beyond that as well, the entire education reform that is required. And this is where he opened the door to more rationalism being required. And I talked a little bit about this between him and his student, Rashid Rida, and what types of commentary or interpretations they wanted to push in Islam, just to change the general thinking and mindset of the Muslims in the Islamic world to move towards progress. We talked about Sayid Qutb. Sayid Qutb is probably the one who introduced the more systematic, with methodology approach to the revival of Islam. Agree with it or not, we're not, putting any judgments right now. We're just presenting things as they are. And so he talked a lot about this idea of the intellectual. He called them the tali'a, those who are at the forefront. They have to be educated in a deep, fundamental way in Islamic sciences as well as contemporary issues and present-day world. Okay, keep that in mind. Beyond that, they have to be the ones who are pushing for solutions to the contemporary social problems of the world. So the politics, the economics, the rights, social justice, and so on and so forth. And this, of course, requires a deep understanding of Islam and the world. And then we talked very quickly about the figure of Muhammad Iqbal, Pakistani. That was at the same time as Pakistan and India were going what they were going through, with at the end having two countries, two states. So officially recognized as a Pakistani figure. And for many until today, especially in that part of the world, but even beyond, people who study Muhammad Iqbal, he's considered, the perfect example of this intellectual that we keep hearing about because of how successful and charismatic and influential he was in the different aspects of life. He was an accomplished poet and philosopher, and eventually a politician who became, the head of his state, and who remained influential and who remained a beloved figure in his state. And so this is considered a very high degree of success for someone who is working and thinking from an entirely Islamic mindset. Okay, and so he was very influential in establishing this idea of having to reform Islamic societies in a way where we take Islam and we learn through ijtihad. This is what his focus was and his contributions were, through ijtihad, which goes way beyond just the legal aspect of religion to all the other aspects of life. And he focused a lot on the spiritual dimension of Islam, those teachings that force the Muslims not to follow blindly whatever is being pushed from the parts of the world that we're supposed to be emulating or catching up to. It's not because that they are ahead of us industrially, technologically, scientifically, that we just take entirely everything else. And so this is where he was pushing for education reforms and knowledge acquisition while being well versed in Islamic teachings, while staying true to the core teachings of Islam. As we said, he put a lot of emphasis on the spiritual Sufi dimension of Islam, with the focus that this clergy cannot be only rational. Right? The philosopher cannot be the traditional philosopher who is only rational. There is a spiritual dimension in Islam that has to be very present. And of course, he's well known to be, very strong on the Sufi dimension too, Muhammad Iqbal. And you see that in his poetry and in his writings, in any case. And so, all of that to say, this is very much in line with what we were saying. And now we have a figure who's trying to put in application all of this with a full state under his control and under his influence to try to put things in place, concretely speaking. And I believe that we ended our discussion last time that we met with Malik bin Nabi. Malik bin Nabi being this very famous Algerian writer, philosopher, thinker, who, to me at least, seems to be very focused on the reasons that led to the fall of the Islamic civilization. So he talks a lot about the idea of civilization. What does it mean to be a civilization? What does it mean to fall as a civilization? And how to rise again. And in truth, this is also, if you read, about Ibn Khaldun, you know that he spends a lot of time on this idea too. And inshallah, we'll come to it later in the series when we talk about studying history and why do we study history and why Islam says to spend time and encourages the study of history. Okay, so he talks a little bit about this, and he says that we have become as a civilization, we have become bankrupt and we have become colonizable. It's like we are inviting others to colonize us. So what has led to this? What is this mind frame that we're in, the attitude that we have that makes us so colonizable? And so a lot of what he does is to analyze the mind, the mindset, and to try to identify the things that lead to this type of consequence or effect at the end, so that you are basically telling the one who already wants to dominate you, he's just looking for a weakness, he's looking for an opportunity to dominate you, to colonize you, to abuse or make use of you, to use you for their own purposes. You are inviting that, and as opposed to defending yourself and preparing yourself ahead, because you know that this is what they're trying to do, right? So he talks a lot about the ideas, for instance, of how easily we have fallen prey to the material progress that we have seen, that at the expense, and this is very interesting, where we see a trend starting to appear, a critique of an over-reliance on rationality. But this is because this is a dry, blind rationality. It's all about what reason says. But human beings are more than just reason. There's also a spiritual dimension. There's also an ethical dimension. There's also a human dimension. So we see a lot of that thinking start to appear. We already saw it in Muhammad Iqbal. We are going to see it here again. So I say this because this is in contrast to what we were seeing with people like Al-Afghani and people like Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rida, where they were saying there's not enough rationality. We have too much superstition. We have too much myth. We have to get rid of that and cleanse our societies from that. And we're going to teach you how to do it. Now we have people like Malik ibn Nabi and others who are saying, no, we can't go too far in rationality. This is what the West did and where we disagree with them. Because at the, they did this at the expense of the heart. They did this at the expense of the soul. They did this at the expense of human dignity, right? So there's no more humanity in their thought. It's all about reason and what it leads to in a practical way, which is scientific progress, industrial progress, economic progress, but there's no human being in there. There's no spirituality in there. It's just dry rationality that does not lead to anything good if you remove the ethical dimension from it, which is what we saw in World War I and World War II. In any case, so he openly says, as I mentioned, the sovereignty of pure reason is the beginning of the decline of the Islamic civilization. The reason why Islamic civilization started to fall is because they blindly started to only look at rationality, dry, blind rationality, as opposed to including the ethical, spiritual dimension in everything that they do. And therefore, the intellectuals must be the ones that lead a spiritual and cultural revival of the Islamic world. That's what we covered until now, very, very quickly. And so today, inshallah, we'll continue. I hope that we can finish the few names that I wanted to cover today. And I'll go quickly. If I'm going too fast, slow me down. There are a few names I think that we need, not necessarily because each one of them is bringing so much new, novel contributions, but because those names have become so influential in the Islamic world and in the Arab worlds. So we have to know who they are, and this is an opportunity to at least mention them so that at the end you can say, I know who these names are. I've heard these names before, and I know why they're important, what they tried to do, and where they fall in this general mapping of the major thinkers who have tried to address this question that we are concerned with. What is the role of the intellectual? So the first name, and this is perhaps the most famous name of an intellectual philosopher in recent times in the Islamic world, I don't know if many of you have heard this name or not, but I assure you that he is the most influential, famous, popular name in the Islamic and Arab worlds especially. He's a Moroccan philosopher by the name of Muhammad Abd al-Jabari. So Muhammad Abd al-Jabari wrote a number of works. His background and specialization, he's a philosopher, he's specialized in the thought of Ibn Rushd. He spent a lot of time, there's a famous philosopher, Averroes, as they Latinize his name in the West, Ibn Rushd. He spent a lot of time, presenting Ibn Rushd and his thought to the rest of the world. So he became very popular, pushed through also, Western means and reasons that elevated his status even further. But in any case, he became very popular and he presented theories that kind of spread a lot. If you know in depth, a lot of what I have been talking about and the names that I have been talking about, especially the ones that came before Al-Jabari, you would know that the contributions of Jabari are limited. Okay, a lot of his main revolutionary major contributions are in fact ideas that were said before him by others. And in some cases, in a much more novel way. But he is the one credited with them. His version and his books and his works became the version that spread in the Arab world, in the Islamic world, and until today. Okay, and so it's important to know who he is and so on and so forth. He spent a lot of time analyzing, like others before him, that's why you see the trend, analyzing the Arab mentality and the Arab mind. And he wrote 4 books, major books, in which he presented all of this. And he's looking at the different dimensions of the Arab mind that has led to the state of the Arab world that we find today, and therefore what needs to be done to change this mentality, this mindset, so that we can reach a revival of the Islamic world. Okay, and so he talks, for instance, about the importance of, I'm not going to go through the historical developments that he goes through. He did a full analysis of all of that. He says that we have to start moving towards truly rational thought. So he falls in the category of those who think that, there is too much myth and superstition and irrational thought going on in the Islamic world and in the Arab world. And so he says we have to change our modes of thinking so that they become entirely rational modes of thinking. This, of course, is not aligned with many other of the thinkers who are saying, no, we need much more of the ethical, spiritual thinking that is required. So he's in the opposite camp. He says that truth in the Islamic world is not always following the rational modes of thinking, and the intellectual is the one who has to perform this role of critiquing and deconstructing the mind and identifying where there is a lack of rationality and replacing it with rationality. So this is where he starts to talk about the role of the intellectual. The intellectual is the one who's going to help their society get rid of the irrational in that world. And so he looks at the ethical and spiritual lens, but he says in a lot of cases, the Muslims, not Islam, the Muslims went too far. So the example is Sufi thinking. Sufi thinking has gone too far in relying on the spiritual and the irrational. So this is an example because Sufism does not have a rational discourse according to him. He has a full attack on the Arabic language and how it is taught because he says that there is an over-reliance on poetry, and poetry is full of symbols and imagery and metaphors and so on and so forth, all means, mechanisms, instruments that take you away from reality and bring you in a fictional imaginary world where you're no longer dealing with the concrete and the tangible. You're dealing with, an open mental universe. And this is not good for a society. This is not good for a culture that is trying to rise in the real world. You have to focus on things that are real, not things that are imaginary and only relying on metaphors and symbols and myths and so on and so forth. He talks about the importance of addressing head-on that in our Islamic societies, is of course talking about the Middle East and in those areas, there is a full stagnation. And the reason for that is that there is a lack of challenge of the tradition. Whatever is inherited from the past is considered sacred, or almost. And so because it comes to us from those who came before, we respect it. Because it comes from our fathers and forefathers and ancestors, we consider it holy. That cannot be touched. But this is a lack of application of the challenge function or the critical mindset that we should apply to everything. And we keep what's good, and whether it comes to us from the whatever is inherited or not, is it useful? Does it lead to the revival that we need or not? If it doesn't, we get rid of it. We don't just keep it because it comes to us from those who came before us. We must engage, he says, and this is through the intellectuals specifically, engage with all cultures and with all societies and be open to all thoughts, because there is something good to be found, and who better than the intellectuals to help us sort all of this out. So he talks about the need at his time, he's writing, a few decades ago, the importance of having to engaging much more with Western thought. So this is in reaction to a movement happening in the Islamic world where, you have thinkers saying, we don't need to look at what the Western mind is producing. Let's just focus on what is happening in our world. We have plenty. There's enough back and forth going on internally. We have enough thinkers and variety and diversity of thought. We don't need to go outside and see what are the Chinese thinkers writing about, and what are the African thinkers dealing with, and what is the Western mind, producing lately, right? So he's saying, no, we have to go out of our way to see what they are producing, and for other reasons too, because they happen to be the ones dominating the world, and so we need to know how they're thinking, and so on and so forth, while, he says, maintaining balance with our own heritage. Then he talks about, which is very interesting, in another of his works, he talks about he does a historical study, and he says that generally speaking, now that he's told us what intellectuals are supposed to be doing in their societies, this is his very indirect way of saying that this is not always an easy task. So he goes back in history so that no one can say, but he's criticizing today's rulers, today's countries where he lives and where others like him live, and where he's working, and the universities he's teaching and so on and so forth. He says historically the figure of the intellectual in Islam was not always free to write and to speak and to teach and to basically speak their mind and to tell others what they're thinking. And so he focuses on Al-Jahil and Ibn Rushd and those figures specifically. He talks about others, but he does a full study on those figures, and he says they were very oppressed in their lives because of their thinking, because they're true intellectuals, and they were brave, and they had the courage to say what they really thought, and this cost them a lot. And this is something that we have to get rid of as Islamic societies and Arab societies if we truly want to evolve and to see a revival in our communities and in our societies. So he talks about the censorship, political repression, persecution, the relationship between tradition and modernity, and religious resistance. And finally, he says, if we apply all of this, we are going to create, so this also gives us an idea of where his mindset is going, we are also going to be able to create truly democratic and rational societies. So in the end, for him, this is what success looks like, a truly democratic, rational society. And the ones who are leading the charge to get us there are the intellectuals, with everything that we said about the role in between. Now, because I talked about Al-Jabari, I have to mention a few other names. Why? Because they also became very prominent in their own right, maybe. The way I see it is, in large part, because of their reactions to Al-Jabari. So, Al-Jabari writes a book. They write a book that becomes equally popular because it's kind of like their own commentary on his work, and they take position where they disagree with some things and they agree with others, and so on and so forth. There are three names here. One of them is George Tarabishi. George Tarabishi is not a Muslim thinker. He's a Christian thinker, but very well known and very, very engaged in all of this. Then there is a very famous Syrian poet by the name of Adonis. Adonis is not his real name, but that's his poet name and the name that he's known with and through in the Arab world. And then there is the Lebanese thinker, philosopher Ali Harb. Those three names are all in the kind of general world of Al-Jabri and his thoughts. And so there's a back and forth. There's complete overlap and complete agreement between them on some things, complete disagreement. Each one of them has different thoughts. But I would put all of these names together because there's a lot of them reacting to each other in their thinking, openly or not. But if you know what the other has said, you know that they're reacting to that idea. And it's not just, a blank page that they just decided suddenly to start talking about this topic or that. They're reacting to each other. So for the case of, so this is just to give very quickly an idea. I think they're all born in the 1930s. I believe, so Al-Jabari has passed away, I think 2010. The others, two of them have passed away. I believe Ali Harb is still alive. I don't remember. So as I said, Adonis is a Syrian poet. It's Ali Ahmed Esbar, his name. He's a well-known thinker. So the way he writes and the way he talks, because he doesn't just write poetry, he has a lot of books talking about all of these issues. He's a secularist. He says that we have to move our societies towards a completely secular model. He pushes a lot for freedom of expression. And so you see a lot of the thinking from Jabari in there. The importance of breaking away from the tradition. What is holding us back and preventing us from seeing the revival that we are aiming for is the tradition, is whatever we have inherited from those who have come before us. Let go of all of that and just start dealing with the reality from now. And so he pushes for a secular Arab identity. And the Arab part is very important to him. This is a part of the heritage we maintain, but the Islamic part we get rid of. Then there is, as I said, Ali Harb. So he is very critical of what he calls, and that's why I'm talking about him. It's another angle. He's openly talking about the intellectuals. He has spent a lot of time talking about how intellectuals, especially the ones who are the ones we all recognize as the intellectuals. So, the university teachers and the philosophers and who live in the Islamic world, he openly calls them the intellectual elites. He says they're delusional. They live in a completely, parallel universe to the reality of the masses. The masses have their needs, their day-to-day realities, what they're struggling with. And you have these thinkers who are in a completely disconnected world, dealing with these ideas, reacting to each other. They're delusional, he says. They're completely disconnected from reality. And so they need to reconnect with the people and the daily lives of the people and address the issues that the people need. There is a lot of outdated ideologies in the Islamic and the Arab world. They have to be cleansed, they have to be rejected and replaced with much more modern thinking. He says the intellectuals are supposed to be and are the agents of true transformation in society. So it's not that they're always that. They can be different, but the majority of them happen to be living in those ivory towers, as they call them, disconnected from the masses. The importance of really looking at social justice, ethical reform, all of that is very important. He's not a secularist. He doesn't say that all society has to move towards an entirely secularist model. So he openly calls for an integration of modern values with authentic and true and foundational Islamic teachings. And that's the core here. We have to first get rid of what is non-Islamic, not authentically Islamic. Once we have that, then we can combine it with what is modern, and we will have what we need for our societies. He wrote extensively on this issue. Again, a lot of it is in reaction to Al-Jabari. He was very critical of intellectuals. As I said, he says they're disconnected from reality. They have very abstract thinking, and they have a stagnation of thought. They're stuck. They can't move beyond certain issues. And in part, he says this is the effect of colonialism. They've been forced to think about certain things. They're stuck in those things. They can't think beyond them, and so on and so forth. So he says there's a crucial importance for the intellectuals to re-examine the past, come up with new interpretations, new norms to look at the heritage and the culture that we have inherited. We can't just keep spinning our wheels and turning in circles. We need new ways of looking at our heritage, and the need to break away from tradition, move towards what he calls his version of secularism, which includes core components of Islam, need to be more active, more present, more critical of reality. This is the role that is expected of the intellectuals, and with an emphasis on Arab identity, Arab nationality, Arab language, so on and so forth, especially with Ali Harb, but we see it with all of these thinkers, Tarabishi, Adonis, and even Jabari. Okay, that was one lump of thinkers that go together. I think I had two more names that I really wanted to cover today, and then I'm going to leave the rest to another time so that it's not too much. The next two names that I wanted to cover, I think they deserve their own discussion, so I'm not lumping them with Al-Jabari, even though there is definitely a lot of reaction to the works of Jabari. But I think it would be reductionist to say that this is why those thinkers deserve to be looked at. One of them is Abdul Wahhab al-Masiri. So he is a major Egyptian academic, and I'll talk a little bit about his thoughts and his contributions. And the other one is Hassan Hanafi. He's another philosopher and Egyptian thinker, very famous, and definitely deserves to be studied in his own right. Abdul Wahhab al-Masiri, 1938 to 2008. He's an Egyptian academic, and he became politically active, especially towards the end of his life. And so, if you can see, he's dying in 2008, so we're starting to see what's happening in the Arab world, and he's starting to take a political stance, and he starts to be much more active. Just to link it to the idea of the engaged or disengaged, thinker and intellectual, he is definitely the type who is very politically active, and we see a lot of that in his life. He has multiple degrees from Western universities, and so when he talks about the West and when he talks about modernity and postmodernity and how they live in the United States and how they live in Europe, and he's talking about it in a way that is someone who has experienced this firsthand and lived there. He's not someone who spent his whole life, in the Middle East or in Egyptian universities, for instance, or. Okay? And so he says, well, before what he says, I'll mention that. But if I were to kind of summarize the main focus of his work, because a lot of it, the initial drive behind his work was supposed to be, literary critique, a little bit like Edward Sayid and other thinkers. It's supposed to be about literature and how it connects to reality and your ability to see how significant literature is or is not. Does it change societies? Does it change mindsets? And so on and so forth. And some of the deeper thinkers who are able to do this, it goes very far. You have to be a philosopher because they link literature to all of that, as opposed to just linking it to its literary value, for instance. In any case, so he's definitely one of those. But his work goes so beyond that. He's not just he is a literary critic, but he's also someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about political systems. And he talks about the question of secularism and the Western version of secularism and whether that's appropriate or not. He talks about modernity in multiple works in detail, the relationship between modernity and Islam. Yes, he talks about literary theory, and he spent a lot of time specifically on the Jewish identity and Zionism. And in fact, he is the one who wrote individually a full encyclopedia of the Jews in 8 volumes that he published out of pocket. Okay, that's a whole discussion and maybe a lecture for another day about that work and what it meant, because it's an extremely extensive, detailed, meticulously researched piece of work in 8 large volumes in which he goes through every dimension and every aspect of not only the religion, because he's not presenting a work of analysis of the Jewish religion. He's more focused on the relationship between Judaism and Zionism and the reality that they are now facing as Egyptians, as Palestinians, and so on and so forth when he was writing. And if I were to condense all of that very quickly and shortly, he's basically putting a lens which was new for that type of world to read in this way. He's putting a lens of colonialism to the Zionist project. That this is European colonialism happening, but the form of it looks different in appearance, the Zionism. But in reality, here you were fighting what you were fighting because it was European colonialism and domination, right? This is happening again. It's just taking a different form, and it's more sophisticated, it's more elaborate, it has a different history, and so on and so forth. In any case, that's a completely different discussion, but the linkages that he makes with Western imperialism as a project and how it's being applied through Zionism is very interesting, especially for when it was published and how he was writing about it. You see that he was well ahead of his time in the way that he was talking about all of this. He talks about how intellectuals are the ones in society who are supposed to be able to recognize different worldviews, different ethical systems, and to contemplate them and analyze them and see what is common to them and what is different between them. He has a detailed critique of Western materialism, and he talks about how, for instance, in the West, they have completely, achieved a complete lack of meaning. They have reached the point where their lives, or as a society, there is a complete lack of meaning. Everything associated with what is postmodern, why did postmodernity happen after modernity? Inshallah, in the future, we'll talk more about postmodernity. So basically, it's also a critique of modernity, but even more to what happened after modernity and the crisis of modernity that led to postmodernity and all of that. So, as we said, a full detailed critique of this Western way of living. And he says Islam protects and preserves the true nature of the human being, the dignity of the human being, the humanity of the human being. And this is what we would lose if we start moving blindly by accepting the values that are non-Islamic. All of this will be out the window, and the proof is this is what has happened to Western societies too. And so he has a lot of focus in the way he writes about ethics and morality and how this is the core of Islam. The core of Islam is not the fiqh. The core of Islam is the ethics, morality, human dignity part of Islam and teachings of Islam. And we would lose that if we blindly start to follow where the West has gone. And so he says in the West there's a complete lack of ethical, spiritual, communal values. In Islam we find values of brotherhood, values of community. You sacrifice for your community, you sacrifice for your family, you sacrifice for a brother or a sister who are not a brother or a sister. They just happen to share, if you want to take it the minimal, they just happen to share your faith. If you want to take the maximum version of it, the Imam Ali version of it, this is someone who is just like you in creation. They're a human being like you. You're supposed to sacrifice for them, right? So in any case, the dignity of the human being, he calls it the centrality. Like he says, I'm going to build my whole theory, everything that I present, at the center of it is the human being. And that, he says, this is not me. This is what Islam says. It's the true version of the human being. And anything that removes that dignity of the human being, as we find in the West, he says, where the human being has been translated into a price, translated into economic terms, translated into a commodity to be used for other purposes. The human is not an end in itself. The human is a means to other ends. That's how human beings are used, and he gives a lot of examples. I don't want to spend too much time on it, where the human being, he says, has become subordinate to the technology, to the economic development, and to other things. And so, therefore, the role of the intellectual has to be to expose the risks and the dangers of going in that wrong direction and not keeping the core teachings and values of Islam, and to resist and to influence. And this is where he is openly saying that the intellectual has a very activist aspect to the role that they play. They are definitely engaged, and this is what we see in his own life too, as I said, and to bring new and real solutions. For instance, so he presents the idea of the partial secularism. He says that we have to move towards secularism because this is required in today's world, but it's partial. It's not the secularism that we find in other societies that he calls total secularism, where there's absolutely no place for religion. There is a place for religion, but we have to determine where that is, where we absolutely need religion in those spaces in public life, and where we can just let people live. And finally, he talks about the need for an authentic modernization. So authentic means Islamic, that it is rooted in Islamic teachings. That's the type of modernization that is required. It's not just blindly following the model that we found in the West, because it will lead us to undesirable consequences. So that's, in short, in a few minutes, you have a crash overview of Al-Masiri. Otherwise, you could spend a lifetime reading his works. Hassan Hanafi, the last, I think, thinker that I wanted to talk about today. I'll mention very quickly Taha Abd al-Rahman. We'll see how much time we have. So Hassan Hanafi, 1935 to 2021. He just passed away. He's an academic. He was a professor at universities. He's someone who has written extensively. I consider him one of those, just like Al-Masiri, they're machines in the prolific nature of their writing and how many books they have produced. So he has focused a lot on social issues, human rights, the need for a cultural revival, and the importance of a dialogue between Islam and the West. So with that said, generally speaking, and just from what I just mentioned, he's considered leftist. So a leftist as in, I can't say that he's, a Marxist communist, but there's a tendency in his works to go in that direction, right? So it's kind of socialist thinking, right? It's all about the community and all about the human rights and non-alienation of humans. A lot of thinking and a lot of borrowing from these notions that came from communist, Marxist, socialist thinking. Okay, so that's one. Very important for him to empower the masses through social justice. So again, this is socialist thinking, this is, communist thinking, but important. And of course, he presents it as, in his earlier works, less Islamic, but in later works, the way he presents this is what Islam says, not what Marx says, for instance. Okay, so this is important to keep in mind. And by the way, when we'll talk about, this could be controversial when I say this, but when we talk about more Shi'i thinkers, for instance, Ali Shari'ati does the same thing. And there's definitely a socialist Marxist tendency to the way he writes, and you can see the influence very directly if you know the works. You know where the ideas come from, but he is able to translate that into Islamic imagery and Islamic tropes or figures, or that's why he talks about Abu Dharr, he talks about Imam Al-Hasany, but the content of it, you can see where the analogies are being drawn. In any case, so Hassan Hanafi definitely has a full critique of the West in a different way than Al-Masiri, but definitely a full critique of the West as well. And what he proposes, I think, is one of the most powerful and very, very strategic approaches, rarely seen in the way that people who address these types of issues is, you can attack the West head on, and a lot have done that. They, as I just said, for instance, with Al-Masiri, they like this, they like that, this is an issue, we can't just blindly follow them, it's the end. Hassan Hanafi didn't do that. When he attacked the so what is, what do we do? What's the so what? So you have a critique and you think that this doesn't work and it doesn't align with us. So he says, first, we have a duty to resist Orientalism. And Orientalism, he says, is the way the West has looked at us. This is the same thing, by the way, as Edward Sayid does in Orientalism, his very famous work called Orientalism. So he says, so Orientalism is a specialization that appeared in Europe for people who are studying the Orient. And with time, they started to specialize, especially in the Middle East and Islam. They romanticize, they distort, they create their own version of who you're supposed to be and how you react. All the way to like the most recent versions, if you want to read the literature, the most recent versions of Orientalism would be that, you're a Muslim, therefore you're a terrorist. Okay, that's Orientalism. They've imposed an idea of you, and you may or may not have anything to do with it. They've decided who you are, how you behave. They know how you think and how you eat and how you dress and what you believe and why you do what you do. No one has asked you anything. No one has really studied you. They've decided. You have a full literature, you have a full, set of scholars and philosophers, and you would say, like, this is the spectrum of what we believe. They'll take someone marginal here and they'll say, Islam believes this because so-and-so wrote that. And you might say, okay, but that thinker that you just mentioned, no one in the Islamic world knows who they are. He's a no-name. Unless you're a specialist in that guy is not representative of Islamic thought. But there's a PhD thesis that appeared somewhere that says, this is what Islam believes. This is Orientalism. This is what studying Orientalism has exposed. And you see the work of Edward Said is focused on this. If you have the patience to read it, I definitely encourage it with all of its shortcomings. This was a revolutionary work when it appeared because, as I've talked about Edward Said in the past, he's a Palestinian American thinker. He's born, raised entirely American, but his origin is Palestinian. He's a Christian thinker, Edward Said, but he was focused on this, and he was a literary critic. So a lot of his work and a lot of his analysis is through literature. He's looking at literary works. But that's exactly what you need to show that this is what has become the general culture in the West. This is representative of the general culture in the West, and that's exactly what he did, and it became revolutionary when it was published years ago. In any case, so he says the importance of resisting Orientalism. So how do I resist Orientalism? There's different ways, different things that we can do this. To me, the most interesting thing that Hassan Hanafi has done is to propose an entirely new discipline. He's like, just like they have Orientalism, we, the Orient, need to create Occidentalism. And we need to start studying the West in the way they are studying us. We need to start understanding what is this mentality that has generated this? What is the mindset and the frame and the attitude and the heritage and the tradition that has led to what we're seeing? Stop accepting to be, the specimen put in a lab that's being looked at, and you just can have to wait. They dominate and they use you as a specimen, they analyze you and they decide for you what you are, and do that to them. You put them in the lab and you start observing them and analyzing them and telling them, by the way, everything that you consider to be the standard and the norm, there are other ways to look at it. And suddenly that which you consider to be the standard, the truth, the right, the good, the beautiful, whatever you think it is the standard, is actually not the standard. And there are different ways to completely deconstruct and destroy these arguments. And we will show you how, with an entire discipline, with specialists and tools, epistemic tools, knowledge tools, disciplinary tools, and specialization, we are going to do that. And today, by the way, there is now a field in the Islamic world, in the Arab world, very well known, just like there is al-istishraq, which is Orientalism. So when you say this is a mustashriq, he's an Orientalist. It's someone who has studied Islam. For instance, those who have studied the Quran over time and they say the Quran is just borrowing from the scriptures of the Jews and the Christians, or the terminology of Islam actually comes from the Syriac language, it's not purely Arabic, or these are all Orientalists. That's why you read their books. It's called Shubuhat al-Mustashriqeen. The questions or the attacks of the Orientalists. Okay? So now there is ilm al-istighrab. Just like there is istishraq, Orientalism, there is now Occidentalism. We are going to study the West just like they study us. And we're going to study their mindset and their attitude and their, heritage and their tradition that has led to what they are. Okay? So ilm al-istighrab, it became a whole thing. And so he says it's time for us to reverse the lens and to start studying the West as a culture, studying the West as a thought form from a non-Western lens, not to use their own tools. We have to come up with our own tools. Stop being Eurocentric. Eurocentric is, Europe is the center of the world or the center of your thinking. Don't be Eurocentric. So create multipolar thinking, as they would say today, right? So from an Islamic lens, we have to look at the West. Muslims have an incredibly rich, diverse history, experience, and thinking. That's one. Just because of our diversity, just because of the heritage, the diversity, the depth, the seriousness of Islamic history, we should have so much that helps us to do this exercise. That by itself is just based on Islamic society. He says, and in addition to that, Islam itself is full of these notions and these tools that allow us to study the West. So whether you look at it from a religious perspective, say like, this is what the Quran has given us in terms of tools. This is what the Hadith have given us in terms of tools, disciplinary tools. That's one way to look at it. The other way is to look at it from just looking at the general thinkers we have produced, the general types of philosophies that have emerged in the Islamic world, the incredible depth of it, the incredible variety of it. All of this puts us in a very good position to perform all of this. And he says an analysis of their ideology, of the Western ideology, is required. An analysis of their values, of their worldview, of their philosophy, of their politics, of their economy. All of this is part of Occidentalism. And therefore, we understand how they have influenced the world at a global stage and how they have dominated the world at a global stage. That's what he wants to get to. So it's very practical. And he says the conclusion of that will make it very clear that whatever they are, it is certainly not universal. This is certainly not the only way to live. There are other ways to see the world, other ways to have ideologies and values and philosophies. This is certainly not the only way. And perhaps it's not so pretty after all. Perhaps their version of the world and how to live is perhaps not as pretty as we are led to believe or it is presented to us. And clearly, the third point to him is that it is not aligned with our values, that it is not aligned with our worldview, it is not aligned with our ethics. And this is kind of the punchline. And so therefore, then now what? So he says that for him, one of his major projects in life, if not the major project, is this idea to decolonize knowledge. He says knowledge is colonized. The tools of knowledge, the type of knowledge, the information that we call knowledge, all of that is currently under Western domination, Western colonization. We have to free ourselves from that by creating our own version of that. And then we can start to think freely in a way that is authentic to us. So to reorient the purpose, the focus of the specific needs of the Arabs and the Muslims. We create things from within through our own effort and through our own values and what we know to be our own needs. Those are the types of tools that we create. Right now we're just following whatever we're given and we're calling it knowledge. And not to follow the agendas of others, not to be passive. And everything that is presented as being universally good, to really think about it and say, is it universally good or is it serving a specific purpose? Is it truly beneficial to all? Therefore, he says to reconstruct the ways of thinking that are Islamic and to create knowledge that is Islamic plus modern, both together. Yes, we need something modern, but it can only come from within Islam and without Western domination. So he says openly again and again in his works, I'm not rejecting modernity. Those things that are beneficial in it, we want to adopt. Those things that are harmful, we want to reject. And in a way that always aligns with our own Islamic values and tradition. In the same line of all of this, we have other thinkers. I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's kind of in the same line and we would need a lecture or more to explain how he differs. But Taha Abd al-Rahman, most recently, he's the Moroccan philosopher right now who is, front and center on the philosophical stage, Islamically speaking, who is taking a lot of these thoughts and pushing them with a lot of philosophical sophistication and specialization and building a whole project around the idea of Islamic modernity. But again, in his mindset, it's whatever we create has to be authentically Islamic, deeply rooted in Islamic heritage, ethics, spirituality, but also modern. So Muslim intellectuals have to create their own alternative of what is the secular Western worldview, the secular Western paradigm. The Muslims have the duty, responsibility to create something that comes from within, equal to that in today's world. And in some of the works, there's another thinker by the name of Al-Hasany. He also talks in the same way, and he says that there is an incompatibility, openly he says, and Taha Abdul Rahman says that too. He says modernity and Islam are not compatible. So you can try to modernize or make Islam as modern as, but the true values of modernity and what is considered modernity and what is the core of Islam, those two things are not fully compatible. Let's not try to keep making it something that we can take one and turn it into the other. Let's recognize that there is something fundamentally not compatible between them and just make Islam go its own path and be its own thing in a way that is fully adaptable to the needs of today. And of course, they always come back to Islamic ethics because they say modernity is completely lacking ethics, and that's the core of the discussion. So Islamic modernity has to be a spiritually centered modernity, and it's the intellectuals who have to provide the ethical alternative to the secular Western paradigm and secular Western worldview. I'll talk about perhaps a few other thinkers, but I think I'm going to stop here for today for sure. I'll see if we want to continue with a few other names, or I'm going to see afterwards the level of interest if you want to mention a quick mention of a few other names. Muhammad Arkoun, Fazlur Rahman, Nasser Hamid Abu Zaid. We can talk about very quickly Tariq Ramadan, Malcolm X. They all have had something to say or something to do with the figure of the Islamic Muslim intellectual, or the role of the intellectual, or the revival of Islam, if you're interested. Otherwise, we stop here. And depending on your level of interest, again, we can talk about for 1 or 2 lectures, tell me, or more if you really insist, on maybe some of the specifically Shia thinkers who have talked about this, and we want to mention quickly, so I'll at least cover it in 1 lecture, but if you want details, we can make it 5, 10 more lectures depending on the level of interest and how far you want to go in their works. So I'm going to stop here. Any questions, concerns, comments, more than happy to take them. And after all of this, inshallah, so we're going to try to come back out of this with a few kind of takeaways, lessons learned for the role of the intellectual in our own Islamic communities. And inshallah, all of this is starting to become clear. We're starting to see a lot of the trends. So we will highlight these. I don't know if I'll go as far as say, and this is what we propose to do. This we keep it for more personal discussions. And then we move on to wrap up the topic of the Islamic community of knowledge, so that we move to the next big heading which we had, which is the disciplines and the types of knowledge that Islam strongly encourages, and what it says about what we should learn and how we should spend our time when we are seeking knowledge, inshallah. And that will wrap up the theme of knowledge. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Wa antum asma'akum. Questions, concerns? تفضلوا. Yeah, so the question is, many of the thinkers have proposed on the one hand to make Islam modern, to modernize Islam, but a few of them have also openly said that Islam and modernity are not fully compatible. To be honest with you, for some of them, if you were to look at different works, you see that one way, the cheap way, the easy way is to say they're contradicting each other. The more sophisticated way is to say that clearly their thinking has evolved. And so as they have thought about all of this, they have moved towards, at the core, they have openly said, at the core, there is something incompatible. Let's not try to, pretend that all of this can be turned into that. That would be taking it too far. But I I think a lot of these thinkers, they kind of all agree, even the ones from the beginning when we were talking about Tahtawi in the early 1800s until now, they're all kind of saying the same thing in a way, if you don't want to be too technical about it. They're all kind of saying that we have to take some things and we have to let go of some things. We have to reject some things. There are things that are compatible with Islam. If you look, I don't know, to take a very simple example, if you look at just simply the idea of being as educated as possible, to be able to have all the knowledge and be self-sufficient so that you don't have to send your best and brightest to go study in the West because your professors and your universities have the infrastructure and have the knowledge, and you can rely on yourself to create that kind of thinking that leads to, industrial, technological, scientific, and even military, because they all talk about the military dimension, to progress and development, then of course you're going to do that. And if you need to go learn it from them, you're going to go learn it from them. So they all agree on this. The question is then to what extent the rest applies. Because modernity, or what it looks like today, which is way past modernity, but I'm trying to keep it simple and not confuse things by adding post-modernity in the discussion, is much more than just scientific progress. It's a whole culture and it's a whole worldview, right? Today, what is a human being and how is a human being supposed to live, and what's the relationship between that human being and other human beings, with the family, with the community, with society, with God, with nature, with all of that, right? So this is where I think they say this is where we draw the line. We have nothing to learn there. We know what we're supposed to be doing. And if we don't know, we need to find the answers internally. The more of these thinkers you look at, the more you see that they kind of, most of them, I mentioned a few exceptions, but I'm intentionally doing that to show you that the majority of them, they kind of agree. It's in the how that they disagree. Some of them say we have to go further in rationality. Most of them say no, going down rationality only is going to become dangerous and we will end up like them. That's what they did. And that's part of the reason why they ended up where they ended up. That's how they got rid of the ethical dimension, the human dignity dimension. That becomes a kind of a theme in all of them. I don't know if that answers. Yeah. Yeah. As opposed to saying they just contradict themselves. تفضل.
better areas and trying to overlook this, and hopefully one day it'll just come back, right? So there's that aspect. And the second aspect is, are there any societies in the world, or cultures or traditions, that have been able to get out of the clutches of post-modernity and modernity? Like, for instance, I don't know, but like, for instance, China, I know economically they have advanced, but in terms of thought and thinking, have they just built on whatever there is, or were they able to, them or anybody else, been able to create their own thought and re-engineer, so to say, what happened in this part of the world to make it their own tradition? And I know Islam is very unique in terms of other societies, and why there is going to be a difference between that and any other society in general.
Yeah, two excellent questions. So the first question, is there any benefit for the masses? You said to kind of recognize that the past maybe up to 3 centuries have been decline in the Islamic world. The second question has to do with societies being able to overcome and modernize, revive themselves and modernize themselves, and to what extent, they've been able to kind of free themselves from the Western paradigm. I think that's how I understand both questions. So the first question is, with regards to the recognition that the past few centuries have not been very good, in short, I think that is of primordial importance, but it is not to everyone's advantage to do that. And there are many who would be very disadvantaged if we focus too much on what led to that and what has happened since. Because the structures that have been put in place, in many cases, have been put in place since then, and they are still there today. And those structures were created so that that state of decline does not change, because that is exactly what is required to serve, the colonial powers. So instead of colonizing you themselves, they will colonize you indirectly through the structures they've put in place. And you will be happily colonized that way, as opposed to unhappily colonized if they were to come themselves physically to colonize you. Right? So there are still very clear structures in place today, power structures, political structures, economic structures across the Islamic world. And the more you go against that, the more the whole world turns against you, the world that is dominated by this type of worldview and that type of thinking. So you become isolated and unable to exist, or almost not able to exist in that world environment. Okay, so for the masses, sure, but who's going to get that to the masses, and who's not going to prevent that from being communicated to the masses, right? So, if you have the freedom to do so, of course, and I think this definitely needs to be part of the normal education of every Muslim in the world, to understand what has happened to the Islamic world. What did it look like? What happened? We're not saying that it was paradise on earth, but it was certainly in a better state than what we have seen the last 3 centuries. So what happened suddenly, and what led to that? And there were awful things, but I don't think that we can lump everything together, because the traditional version is also awful. To say that there was a golden age of Islam is also awful. It's a golden age when compared to the dark ages of Europe and what they were doing in Europe at that time. Yes, that is a golden age. And depending on what you want to look at, if you want to look at what were the Muslim thinkers, what were the Muslim philosophers, what were the Muslim physicians working on, when Islam was 2 centuries, 1 century and 2 centuries and 3 centuries old versus what was happening in the rest of the world, yes, 100% that's a golden age. Islam was 8 centuries ahead of the rest of the world in a lot of things. What just happened? But that's a problem too. If you go too far in that, they don't go to the cause. The Arabs were living as nomads and savages in the middle of nowhere. And then 100 years later, they have scientists who are 800 years ahead of the rest of the world when it comes to the physics of looking through a lens and how the light reflects inside a lens, or doing anatomy and understanding the chemical effects of plants inside the body. which the West started to look at 800 years later. For 800 years, Ibn Sina's canon, al-Qanun, in medicine, was used as the curriculum, the textbook in all medicine and pharmacology in the West for 8 centuries. How come? What happened in the Islamic world that suddenly you're so ahead of the world? That part no one talks about. Because it forces you to go back to say, well, clearly the revolution was Islam. Was this man, Muhammad himself, and whatever he did to the Arabs has the potential to change the world at that rate and in that way if people actually believe in what he brought to them and they embrace it and they move on it. But if you have a secularist mentality and say it's all about science and progress and rationality, well, that you're not interested in that part. You're just interested in, no, they were rational thinkers who were pushing and there was a scientific culture and there was investments from the country. But that's not what led to it. A century before, none of that was happening. Usually this doesn't happen overnight. There's something revolutionary here. There's something that doesn't match any laws of society or progress or so on and so forth. So this is a piece that, like, if it's presented, it needs to be presented properly. But once presented, I think, of course, today, to be an aware Muslim, you need to understand that heritage of Islam, the heritage of where you come from, and what has happened to you objectively, in a neutral way, in a way that recognizes, here are our shortcomings. Here's where we fell short. Here's where we made mistakes. Here's what we need to change so that this doesn't keep happening, that we get ourselves out of it. Otherwise, this is never going to go away and it's just going to keep getting worse. Right? Like that's the reason why we're supposed to study history, or even supposed to study our reality. The Holy Quran is so clear when it criticizes the Muslims. They just went through a war with the Holy Prophet and they betrayed the Prophet and they lost miserably, and that's not enough. No, the Quran comes with a whole set of verses to remind them, here's how you made the mistake and here's how you didn't obey and this is the consequence of why. That's it. There's a clear lesson here. Study it so that this never happens again. This is textbook. There's a pattern. You learn from it, you can move on. We don't want to see the same mistakes again. The only way to do that is to objectively say, this is the reality that we are in. 3 centuries of this, this was the natural conclusion and consequence of what was there before. The complete failures of the Uthmaniyin, the complete failures of the Ottoman Empire. But today people still talk about it as though it was, the Khilafah. And that's the only way that we can live as, come on. Like, it was a completely miserable, failed type of state. And today, if we want to look at it neutrally, you'd say that their only obsession was to expand their geographical lands at the expense of every citizen and every ethnicity and every culture that lived in an incredibly large state already. They just want obsessively and for no reason to keep expanding. And so they were taking from those who have a bit more at the expense of those who have nothing and forcing everyone to go and fight wars that they were just losing one after the other. Stay put, better manage your people, better manage your resources, create education systems, allow your own citizenry to become more educated, more prepared, more religious. But you wouldn't have ended where you ended. But you had no state. It was just in name. You still had something called the Ottoman Empire. In any case, now we're going on a rant. The second question had to do with, have there been any states that have been able to modernize themselves and pull themselves out? There is something that happened a few years ago, and I don't want this to be turned into what it is today, because when it started, that's exactly what they were trying to do. It started with BRICS. Those specific countries came together at the international level. So Brazil and Russia and India and Singapore, and they came together and they said, we are not happy with the way things are going internationally and we have to pull ourselves up. But for this to even be something we could dream of, we have to start looking at the political systems, at the economic systems, at the education systems, at the health systems of the world. Because we are stuck in an infrastructure that forces us to remain what we are and to keep falling behind, and we can never play catch up. So unless this is done for us, which will never be the case, we're going to change the reality of the world ourselves. We're going to take things into our own hands, matters into our own hands, and start making changes where we have control. And because this is impossible to do alone, we're going to work together. And so you see every country of these countries started to focus on some areas. First, they have to clean up a lot of the corruption so that they can actually start working internally. Secondly, some of them concentrated more, let's say, on the health system. Others concentrated more on education. And so you have a country like Singapore that focused more on education that will lead to economy in a generation. Because I'm not going to focus on the ones who are now adults or 18 years old. I'm going to focus on the ones who are being born now. So that in 25 years, my workforce is going to look like this. And we are going to have entirely well thought out strategic curriculum of science, curriculum of technology, what we're going to teach them, how we're going to teach them math, how we're going to teach them coding, how we're going to teach them, so that we have a full industry in place in 25 years, which is exactly what they did. Suddenly Singapore becomes a country that everybody has to talk about and partner with, and it wasn't the case. That wasn't the case before. This is a major revolution. Or when you talk, for instance, about what China was able to do economically, really, they say China was able to, yes, there's a whole strategy underlying it, but economically speaking, they had to create an entire middle class where there was none, right? It was, you had the poor and you had the rich, and there's no middle class, but the middle class can completely drive entire industries. And at the volume that they have, you need to tweak the economic system and allow them to do it. But if you have a middle class, then they need to sustain themselves. And you need to take them out of the farms, because they're just sustaining themselves and their family. We want them to do things that sustain the entire country and participate in the world economy. Is this good? I'm not saying it's good. I'm just saying this. There was a plan and they moved towards it and they accomplished it. The same thing with other countries. I'm not saying none of these are success stories in the absolute, but for the specific things that they identified for themselves as goals, yes, they modernized completely. But modernity is so much more than that. And what we've been focused on is not any of this, because the Islamic thinkers are saying this is not the issue. The Islamic thinkers are saying the issue with modernity is at the spiritual level. It's at the ethical and moral level. And this is the part that we have not been able to resolve. The rest we can take and we can apply blindly. We have corruption, we have political systems, we have censorship, but they're very clear and everybody sees them and everybody knows. But then how do you deal with the more wicked problems, right? The problems that require real solutions. How do we create a system where we're not just going to blindly follow what they're doing there? Because right now that's all that will happen. You get rid of all of that and you allow that society to move in that direction. Isn't it already doing that? Isn't it already consuming whatever they consume? Or at least that's the dream. That if they're driving that car in that country, then I have to drive it here, and that's the definition of success. It's not I'm going to become a self-sustaining country and create my own cars and create my own version of luxury and my own version of, no, I'm going to copy. And it means that even if you were to get rid of the barriers, the systemic barriers, you're not going to be able to achieve the Islamic version of modernity today in those societies. That's the saddest part. But now I'm giving away the punchlines and it's just ranting now, right? That's the issue. The issue is that you do not have a solid foundation where you've actually been able to create, to use the term that Qutb was talking about, the tali'a, those who are, the true at the forefront intellectuals who have been able to create or find great enough mass of people who are going to lead that type of thinking in society. You have a critical mass that knows that I'm never going to just blindly follow. Good luck. Because right now, we are all blindly following. And, as a mass, individually, you might be able to find the differences. But as masses of people, it's blindly following. And there is no alternative on the horizon. When you look at, what leads to the moral deterioration, the spiritual deterioration, you see that all the causes are in place. And you haven't even fully opened the floodgates, and you see that the decline and the deterioration is already happening at a much faster pace in some cases than you find in other societies. So imagine if you were to completely open the floodgates, what would that look like? Right? So that's where I think the major failure It's currently the case today, and we'll see, you know. Our job right now is at least to raise our own awareness and to talk about it. We stop here? Okay. Inshallah, next week we continue with this. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله الطيبين الطاهرين.